Hello guys, and welcome to Nerdgasms Galore. Today we will discuss an American 1981 horror comedy film named An American Werewolf in London. Be aware there are spoilers ahead. Please leave a comment on your favorite scene or characters and don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support is much appreciated. The movie starts with two American college students named David Kessler and Jack Goodman, backpacking across the Yorkshire moors of northern England. As night falls, the boys are cold and hungry and stop at a local pub called the Slaughtered Lamb. As they enter the pub, they are coldly greeted by the locals. As the boys are seated and wait for their tea, Jack notices a five-pointed star on the wall. One of the regulars tells an off-color joke and everyone is laughing, including David and Jack. Jack uses this moment to ask why the bar has a five-pointed star on the wall. The bar immediately falls silent. If the locals were cold when the boys first arrived, they're even colder now. The change in attitude prompts David and Jack to leave, but before they leave, the pub-goers warn them to keep to the road, stay clear of the moors, and beware of the full moon. As David and Jack continue their trek, still cold and hungry, they try to figure out what could have upset the folks back at the pub, while unknowingly drift off the road and onto the moors when suddenly begins to rain and the fog surrounding them grows thicker. Jack and David quickly change their conversation from the pub to sarcastically comparing the wonderful weather in Rome to what they are currently experiencing. Meanwhile, back at the Slaughtered Lamb, the barmaid and the pub-goers debate whether or not they should leave and assist the boys when cuts the conversation short. David and Jack also hear the howl and begin to speculate as to what it could be, maybe a coyote or a sheepdog. The howling continues and the pair decide it might be in their best interest to go back to the Slaughtered Lamb. The sound of howling is now replaced by the sounds of snarling and growling. The sounds are getting closer to the pair as the creature circles them. David and Jack take off running in the opposite direction of the beast when David suddenly falls to the ground. As Jack offers David a helping hand, the creature pounces on him, mauling him to death. David runs away in fear but goes back to help Jack, only to be attacked by the vicious creature. The beast is shot and killed by some of the pub-goers, who came out searching for the boys. Instead of a dead animal, David sees the corpse of a naked man lying next to him before passing out. It's 3 weeks later and David is unconscious, laid up in a hospital. Nurse Price is tending to him, asks the doctor what happened to him, and the doctor explains that he and his friend Jack were attacked by a crazy man and that the lunatic must have been very powerful to do what he did. As the doctor examines David's eyes, David is dreaming that he is running through the forest. David wakes up to see Dr. Hirsch and Mr. Collins, a United States ambassador, standing over him. They inform him that he is in a hospital in London and that his friend Jack is dead. David becomes hysterical and demands that he see Jack. The doctor tells David he will have some scars that will be boast-worthy, and also adds that a lunatic can sometimes have the strength of 10 men. As Dr. Hirsch is about to leave the room, David mutters before passing out that it wasn't a man, it was a wolf. David is later interviewed by Police Inspector Villers and Sergeant McManus. Inspector Villers tells David that according to eyewitness reports, both he and Jack were attacked by an escaped lunatic. David insists that they were not attacked by a man, but rather by some sort of rabid dog or wolf. Inspector Villers tells David that the case has been closed. Later, David has another dream. He's naked, running through the woods, hunting deer. He attacks one of the deer and tears off its head and proceeds to bite into it. Nurse Price checks in on David to make sure he has eaten his food, which he hasn't. The two address each other by their first names and get to know one another. Later that evening, David has another dream. He's running through the woods, but this time instead of seeing deer, he sees himself sleeping in a hospital bed. As Alex approaches the bed, David wakes up revealing animal-like eyes, along with fangs as he snarls. The next morning, David tells Dr. Hirsch about his dream, and that he has never had dreams so vivid. David explains to Dr. Hirsch that there is no way a man could have done what he did to both him and Jack. He asks the doctor if he saw Jack's torn-up body. Dr. Hirsch informs David he did not see Jack's body, and that David's wounds were attended to and cleaned up before he arrived at the hospital. Later that evening, Alex is reading to David. David is dreaming he is back home in America with his family. There is a knock at the door. His father answers the door and is suddenly gunned down by Nazi werewolves. They massacre his entire family and torch his home before killing him. David wakes up telling Alex he just had a terrible nightmare. Alex gets up to open the curtains, so she can put David at ease by brightening up the room, when suddenly a Nazi werewolf jumps out from behind the curtains, stabbing Alex repeatedly to death. David wakes up, saying holy shit. He's just had a nightmare within a nightmare. The next morning, an orderly delivers David his breakfast. As the orderly leaves, David sits up in his bed and sees an undead, ripped to pieces Jack standing at the foot of his bed. Jack explains to David that the beast that attacked them was a werewolf, and reveals to David that he is now a werewolf too because he survived the attack. Jack urges David to kill himself before the next full moon in order to lift the curse of the werewolf. Jack explains that he died an unnatural death and is now cursed to linger undead for as long as the bloodline of the werewolf exists. He tells David that he will kill people and that he must kill himself. David gets upset and calls a nurse for help. Alex runs into the room and sees that David is distraught. She asks him if he's okay when David suddenly kisses her. He tells her that he just saw Jack and that he himself is a werewolf. Alex is concerned for David and asks him if he will be okay when he is discharged tomorrow. Alex invites David to stay with her back at her place and the two end up having sex. Later that evening, while Alex is asleep, David goes to relieve himself in the bathroom and is visited once again by Jack, who's in an advanced state of decay. Jack reminds David that the full moon is tomorrow night and he will become a werewolf and kill people. Jack once again urges that David end his life. Meanwhile, Dr. Hirsch takes a road trip to the slaughtered lamb to see if what David has told him is true. When asked about the incident with the two American boys, the pub-goers deny any knowledge of David, Jack, or the attack. However, one distraught pub-goer speaks to Dr. Hirsch outside the pub and says David should not have been taken away, and that everyone else will be in danger when he transforms. While Alex is gone to work, David is restless and anxious with no appetite. When the full moon rises, David goes through a grueling transformation from human to werewolf. David, who has transformed into a werewolf, prowls the streets in the London Underground, killing and slaughtering 6 people. The next morning, he wakes up naked in a wolf enclosure at the London Zoo. With no memory of what happened, David manages to find his way back to Alex's apartment. Dr. Hirsch calls Alex for David's whereabouts. Alex informs the doctor that David has arrived, which Dr. Hirsch tells Alex that she must bring David to the hospital immediately. David and Alex catch a cab. While driving to hospital, the cab driver tells Alex and David of the last night's massacre. After realizing he had transformed into a werewolf and was responsible for the previous night's murders, David unsuccessfully attempts to have himself arrested in Trafalgar Square. He visits Piccadilly Circus, calls his family from a phone booth to tell them he loves them, and then loses courage after attempting and failing to sever his own wrists with a pocket knife. Outside of an adult movie theater, David unexpectedly encounters Jack, who is in an even more advanced state of decay. Jack is accompanied by David's previous night's victims, the majority of whom are furious with David and suggest various ways for him to commit suicide. It's a full moon and inside the movie theater, David reverts to his werewolf form. Chaos ensues inside the theater. The police arrive shortly after and lock down the theater. Inspector Villers and Sergeant McManus appear on the scene just as David breaks out of the theater. David leaps after Inspector Villers and bites his head off. David wreaks havoc in the streets of London, accidents occurring everywhere, people are crushed, run over, and tossed from their vehicles, all in an attempt to avoid David. David is eventually cornered and surrounded by police in an alleyway. Alex runs down the alleyway and attempts to put David at ease. She tells David that she loves him. David's consciousness appears to recognize her for a brief moment before lunging forward at Alex. The police open fire. Alex cries while staring at David, who has reverted to human form, lying dead and naked on the ground. Thank you for watching.